He was yanked by his coat like a stray animal, dragged across polished marble, while his briefcase burst open and papers scattered at the feet of strangers who pretended not to see him. Black skin, clean suit, calm voice. None of it stopped the guard's hand or the cold stares that followed, as if he'd committed a crime just by walking in. No one asked his name. No one questioned the violence. He wasn't escorted out. He was erased, humiliated in full view, discarded without a word. But behind that silence was something no one expected. A man with a past far more dangerous than the systems that turned on him. A truth buried so deep it was never meant to surface. What started as discrimination would unravel into something far darker, and those who looked away would wish they hadn't. If this moment hit you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what do you think they didn't see coming? The glass doors of Ashton Bank and Trust opened without a sound, releasing a cool rush of air that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and polished wood. It was a high-end institution, the kind of place that offered espresso in porcelain cups, and didn't just serve wealth, they curated it. The marble underfoot was flawless, veined like pressed ivory, and reflected the brass accents that shimmered across the vaulted lobby. Everything about the place told you who it was designed for, those who belonged. And Everett Lamar? He thought he belonged. He didn't walk in like he owned the place. That wasn't his style. He walked in like a man who had done everything the right way, who had paid his dues, dressed the part, booked the appointment, and showed up exactly on time. His dark gray suit fit him well. His shirt collar was stiff and white, his tie simple but elegant. He had shaved that morning, pressed his slacks, polished his shoes until the leather shone. He carried a briefcase, black, real leather, and worn only slightly at the corners, with a file inside that bore the logo of the same bank he now stepped into. The woman behind the front desk didn't meet his eyes. She looked at him with a kind of mild suspicion, the kind reserved for someone who walked in through the front door without first being seen through a camera. Everett offered a calm greeting and gave his name. He mentioned his appointment with Mr. Donahue. He even showed the confirmation on his phone, a clean email with a timestamp and meeting code. The receptionist's fingers tapped on her keyboard with mechanical slowness, but her eyes didn't search the screen as much as they hovered near him, cautious, sizing him up like a poorly dressed guest at a black tie party. She asked him to take a seat, that someone would be with him shortly. He thanked her, took a seat. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. No one came. No one called his name. A few other clients arrived, 2 in suits with visible Rolexes, another in a bright dress and matching handbag. All were greeted quickly, efficiently, and disappeared behind a frosted glass door. Everett approached the desk again. He asked politely if there had been an update. The woman didn't smile this time. She asked for his name again, as if she had never seen him before. She didn't hide the irritation in her voice. She told him to sit back down. She checked. That was when the man in the blazer arrived. His frame was thick and square, his hair buzzed close to the scalp, his belt looped with a badge and a radio. He didn't speak to Everett. He leaned over the desk and said something to the receptionist. She nodded. Then the man turned. His eyes met Everett's with flat indifference. He said the words without force, without aggression, as if they were policy. "You'll need to leave." Everett blinked. He said he had an appointment, that he was a client, that there must be a mistake. The man stepped closer. "You'll need to leave." Again, no raised voice, no explanation, just decision, absolute and final. Everett reached for his phone to show the email again. The man took hold of Everett's coat by the back collar and began to move him. Not guide, not escort. Move. Everett's feet scrambled beneath him. He didn't resist. His shoes slid slightly on the marble, one catching on the edge of a rug near the teller line. The briefcase in his hand swung free and hit the floor, snapping open. Documents spilled across the marble. The receptionist flinched, not out of concern, but as if annoyed by the inconvenience. A client turned and watched without intervening. No one spoke. No one asked a question. Everett reached for his files, trying to gather them as the guard tightened his grip. One sheet tore beneath his palm. His tie shifted out of place. His coat was wrinkled now, one side riding higher than the other. When the doors opened, the air outside was warmer. The sun had risen fully, but Everett felt cold. The guard let go of him just beyond the threshold. No warning, no apology, just turned around and went back inside. The briefcase was tossed after him. Everett caught it with one hand, but not before it hit the cement, the edge splitting slightly. He looked up at the building. No one inside looked at him. Not the guard, not the receptionist, not the man in the expensive watch who had watched the scene play out from a leather chair without saying a word. Everett sat on the bench a few feet from the doors. He adjusted his coat. The collar was bent, one button loose. He tried to press the folder inside the briefcase back into shape. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anger, but from something deeper. The kind of helplessness you don't show in public. The kind you bury in your chest, silently. He had followed every rule, worn the right clothes, spoken clearly, booked an appointment. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been treated like a trespasser, a threat. Like his presence in that space was unnatural. He didn't call anyone. He didn't take a picture. He didn't tweet about it or record a statement. He just sat there, staring through the glass, watching as other clients entered and were greeted, offered coffee, walked into back rooms. He was no longer a client. He wasn't anything. A name erased from a list. A body removed from sight. All of it felt like theater now, a performance for a stage that had already decided the script without his input. That night, he didn't eat. He loosened his tie and stared at the neat stack of books on his desk, all part of his preparation for a financial shift involving the trust his late mother had placed under Ashton Banks' care 15 years prior. She had done so believing in its reputation, in its prestige, in its promise of discretion and integrity. Now Everett couldn't shake the image of his briefcase flying open, papers scattered across the floor like refuse in a space where names like his no longer meant protection. The next morning, he tried again. Not to return to the same branch, he wasn't foolish, but to contact Mr. Donahue directly. He called 3 times. Each call led to voicemail. He left a message the first time, then hung up the next 2. He sent an email. It bounced. Not failed delivery. Rejected. The kind of error that happens when an address has been deactivated or blocked. He tried calling the main office line instead and asked to be connected. The operator said there was no listing for a Donahue in the directory. Everett froze. He double-checked the spelling, checked his previous emails. Donahue had responded to him just 5 days ago. He asked the operator if there was perhaps another listing, perhaps a supervisor. She said if he had business with the bank, he should contact the client engagement department. She transferred him without waiting for a reply. The man who answered this time had a brighter tone, artificial and chirpy. Everett explained who he was, detailed the situation, emphasized the abrupt cancellation and physical removal he had endured, and asked how best to proceed. There was a long pause, and then the voice said the account in question showed an inactive status, and no meeting had been scheduled. Everett felt his body tense. He repeated the appointment confirmation. He described the time, the emails, the documents. The voice said that if there were no active account identifiers, there was nothing they could do. Everett gave the account number. The man asked him to wait, then returned 30 seconds later with the same answer. The record could not be verified. When Everett asked what that meant, the man repeated the phrase, "It cannot be verified." When he asked to speak to someone higher, he was told there was no available manager. When he asked to file a formal complaint, the call disconnected. Everett stared at his phone. He tried calling again. The line now led directly to a pre-recorded message. "We're sorry, but the number you have dialed is no longer accepting calls from this device." He checked his email again, tried sending another message. It bounced again. Every attempt, every avenue that had once been open, was now closed. He was no longer a client. He was no longer a contact. He was no longer recognized. In desperation, he drove across town to a smaller Ashton branch. It was less opulent, less showy, with only 2 tellers and a narrow waiting area. He walked in, dressed again in his press slacks and sport coat, this time without the tie. He didn't want to appear confrontational. He approached the desk, asked if he could speak with someone about a locked account. The teller was polite enough, asked for his name, asked for identification. Everett handed over his driver's license and the account documents he brought. She typed into the terminal. Her expression changed. Her fingers stopped. She looked up and said the system was asking her to call someone before proceeding. She excused herself. She returned with a man in a dark suit and silver name tag. He introduced himself as the branch manager and asked Everett to step outside with him. Confused, Everett followed. Once they were outside, the man's tone changed. He explained in curt terms that Everett's presence on Ashton premises had triggered a compliance hold. Everett asked what that meant. The manager would not explain. He said only that the bank was within its rights to decline service. Everett asked what had happened to his account. The manager said they were not authorized to discuss internal flags with unauthorized persons. When Everett reminded him that he was the account holder, the man said his identification could not be verified against a current record. Everett asked if he could try another branch. The manager said the compliance flag was internal across all systems. He was told to leave. Again, Everett looked around. The few customers inside watched through the glass, their expressions unreadable. He walked back to his car in silence, his limbs heavy, heart pounding but face composed. He drove aimlessly for an hour before stopping in a strip mall parking lot and sitting there. He dialed the attorney who had helped oversee his mother's trust. The call went straight to voicemail. He left a message, then another. He checked his text messages. None from anyone related to the case. He called again. No answer. The silence felt deliberate. After the second letter arrived, this time printed on the same unmarked stock paper and stamped with an unfamiliar reference number. He knew it wasn't some clerical error. The message was clear. He was no longer welcome, not only as a client, but as a presence within the institution. His attorney hadn't returned his messages. His advisor had given him nothing but vague responses and apologies without clarity. When he tried to contact the compliance department directly through a number he found buried in an old account document, the line rang once, then went dead. What concerned Everett now wasn't the dismissal, it was the erasure. He had ceased to exist in the one place where his name had once held weight, and the more he tried to assert his presence, the faster they seemed to scrub it away. Still, he refused to retreat. He printed every email, documented every failed call, copied every piece of correspondence he had on record, then placed it all into a new binder marked with the date of the initial incident. He dressed again in his press slacks, this time adding a sweater over his shirt and leaving the tie in the closet. He drove not to the main branch nor to the small one that had sent him away, but to another office across the city, a satellite location near the edge of town, small enough to be unassuming but official enough to hold weight. As he entered, the building's interior felt more modest, the lighting warmer, the decor less polished than the downtown branches. A single teller stood behind the desk, and a man in a gray shirt sat at a desk in the corner, his badge clipped loosely to his belt. Everett approached the teller, presented his ID, and politely asked to speak with someone regarding an account status. The teller, young and unsure, took the ID and glanced at the name, his eyes narrowing slightly before turning to the screen. After a few clicks, he looked up and said he needed to notify the branch manager. Everett waited. The man in the corner desk rose and walked over slowly. He didn't smile. He introduced himself with the dry formality of someone used to giving bad news and explained that Mr. Lamar's records were currently under security review. When Everett asked what that meant, the man paused, then said it was standard protocol. When asked what initiated the review, the man said he wasn't authorized to disclose that information. When Everett tried to explain his situation, his meetings, the correspondence, the appointments that had vanished, the man listened, then nodded and said he would file a report. No apology, no commitment, just another promise that led nowhere. Everett asked if the account still existed. The man said yes, but that it was locked pending the outcome of the review. Everett asked if he could obtain a copy of the review. The man said it was internal only. Everett pressed harder, asking if he could speak to the regional supervisor or have something in writing. The man's tone hardened. He said the best he could offer was a case reference number. Everett took it. He returned to his car with the paper in hand and sat there, engine off, watching the reflections in the bank window. He saw himself as they saw him. Not a person, not a client, but a complication, an outlier to be handled quietly, one redacted document at a time. That night, he drafted a formal letter addressed to Ashton Banks, head of operations. He included copies of every message, every call log, every appointment detail. He mailed it to the corporate headquarters with tracking, requested a signature upon delivery, and waited. A week passed. Then another. Nothing came. He tried calling the number again, this time from a different phone. The line rang 4 times, then dropped. Determined to find anyone who would acknowledge him, Everett called in a favor from a distant acquaintance who had once worked in regional banking. She agreed to meet for coffee, but seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she sat down. When Everett explained his situation, her face changed. She told him she couldn't say much, only that sometimes a compliance flag wasn't about the client. It was about the institution protecting itself. When he pressed her, she refused to give details. She wished him luck and left quickly. The phrase stuck with him, protecting itself. Everett returned home, reread every file he had. He had never missed a payment, never bounced a check, never committed fraud or failed to file. His background was clean. His credit was excellent. There were no justifiable reasons for this kind of lockout. He reviewed the trust documentation from his mother's estate. Every clause, every name, every signature. All of it was legitimate. All of it was real. He had trusted Ashton because she had trusted Ashton. But trust, he now realized, was not enough. The next morning, Everett decided to visit the regional headquarters in person. He knew the address, had driven past it many times, a tall mirrored structure on the edge of the business district, with manicured hedges and a private parking deck. As he pulled in, a man in a dark vest approached his car. Everett rolled down the window and gave his name, explaining he had an appointment to speak with someone in compliance. The man checked a tablet, frowned, and said there was no appointment scheduled. Everett said he would wait. The man said waiting wasn't permitted on the premises. Everett said he was a client. The man said his name wasn't in the registry. She checked twice, then handed it back to him with a casual apology and told him the full price, which was almost $300. Everett didn't argue. He paid in cash, but the unease settled immediately, not because of the cost, but because of what it represented. The next day, he stopped by his dry cleaner to pick up 2 suits. The man behind the counter recognized him, greeted him, then frowned when he searched the system and said the ticket didn't bring up any results. Everett showed his phone with a text notification of the order being ready. The man checked again and said maybe the system had cleared the order already. He went to the back and returned with only 1 suit. The other was missing. There was no record. When Everett asked for a manager, the man said he was the manager and offered him a discount, but Everett declined. It wasn't about the suit. It was about the pattern. Everything tied to his name, his ID, his records, things that had always been consistent, now flickered like shadows, present one moment, gone the next. The following week, Everett attempted to book a private workspace at a business lounge where he had maintained a long-standing membership. But when he tried to check in, the front desk associate told him there was a hold on his membership due to unpaid dues. Confused, Everett explained that his dues were auto-drafted and had always been. The associate checked again, said the payment had been declined 2 weeks ago and that the account was suspended. Everett asked to speak with the supervisor. The supervisor came, polite but firm, saying they could not reinstate the account until payment was verified. Everett pulled up his banking app, only to find it wouldn't load. He tried a different network, still nothing. When he called the helpline for the service provider, the call dropped twice before he finally reached someone who told him there had been a service limitation placed on his account due to identity verification issues. She couldn't provide more detail. Everett asked for a supervisor. The call was disconnected. Again. He stared at his phone screen, his own name displayed at the top of the app, now nothing more than a label with no authority. Determined to stay composed, he went to a local bank branch, one not affiliated with Ashton, to inquire about opening a secondary checking account. The representative was courteous at first, but when she scanned his driver's license, her expression changed. She said there appeared to be a flag on the ID, something related to compliance, and that unfortunately she would not be able to proceed. Everett asked what the flag was, but she couldn't explain. She simply said she was unable to process the request. Everett left the bank in silence, trying to keep his breathing steady, trying not to feel the creeping dread that now shadowed his every interaction. He sat in his car and checked his credit reports. 2 of the bureaus had locked files. The third listed a hold under federal compliance status. He had never defaulted on a loan, never missed a payment. His record had been flawless. Now it was tarnished by a mark he couldn't trace, attached to a protocol he couldn't access. The following day, he visited the office building where he had occasionally rented executive conference space to host client meetings. The receptionist there, a woman who had previously welcomed him with familiarity, now barely glanced at him before saying the building was undergoing renovations and that private access would not be available until further notice. Everett asked for clarification, mentioned he had seen others entering. She said they were tenants. He asked if he could confirm with the building manager. She said he was unavailable. Everett stood there for a long moment, looking at the familiar walls, the neutral art, the polished elevators that had once opened for him without resistance. He left without another word. That afternoon, he visited the Langford Community Library, a building his mother had once donated to during its construction, and which still bore a small brass plaque near the entrance with her name. He went to the archives desk and requested access to property records. The librarian asked for ID, scanned it, then told him his registration didn't appear in the system. Everett explained he had registered years ago. She said they had recently upgraded systems and that some profiles didn't transfer. She offered to help him register again. When she entered his name, the screen froze. She apologized, said the network must be having issues. She tried again. This time, the screen went black. She called someone over from tech support. The technician typed something. He logged in through a secure desktop system at a public co-working office, using 2-factor authentication as usual, entering the password with fingers that trembled not from nerves, but from a rising sense of anticipation that had begun to accompany each attempt to reassert his place in the system. The login failed. He reset the password, confirmed the authentication code sent to his alternate device, and tried again. This time he entered the platform, only to receive an immediate notification. Your account has been placed under temporary review due to a compliance lock. He clicked the provided link for more details, but it redirected him to a generic help page without specifics, only a short paragraph that mentioned routine security checks and the possibility of government audit protocols. Everett called the support number, reached a polite automated system that looped him through menus until a human voice came on the line. The representative listened to his concern, asked for verification details, then placed him on hold for 7 minutes before returning with the phrase Everett now knew better than to question. "I'm sorry, but your access has been suspended for internal reasons we are not authorized to disclose." When Everett asked if the funds were frozen, the voice simply repeated the phrase, emphasizing that the matter was out of the department's hands and had been referred to the regulatory division. When Everett requested to be transferred, the call dropped. He called again. The number no longer accepted incoming calls from his phone. He switched devices and called once more, only to be routed into a voicemail system without space to leave a message. He sat still for several minutes, listening to the empty tone, then closed the laptop and stared out the window, his reflection now resembling a man slowly being unstitched from his own life, his ties to everything once certain slipping through his hands like water. Later that day, Everett stopped by a bank where he had kept a modest savings account since college, one he hadn't touched in years but remembered as reliable. The branch was smaller, located near the neighborhood where he once rented his first apartment, and he hoped the lower profile might mean fewer barriers. He entered, took a number, and waited 20 minutes before being called to the counter. The teller greeted him, asked for identification, and began typing. Her smile faded after a few keystrokes. She looked at him again and asked if he had another form of ID. Everett presented a second government-issued card. She examined it, typed more, then excused herself. She returned with a man in a white shirt and navy tie who introduced himself as the assistant branch manager. The man apologized and explained there was a hold on the account pending identity verification, and that unfortunately no withdrawals or inquiries could be processed until the flag was cleared. Everett asked what the flag was. The man said he wasn't permitted to view the origin, only the system-level status. Everett asked if the flag came from their bank or from an external source. The man said he didn't know, but that such flags typically originate from centralized financial databases. Everett pressed for clarification, growing more firm in tone, but not aggressive. The man's body language shifted. He straightened his posture and suggested Everett contact customer security directly using the hotline on the back of his card. Everett nodded once, said nothing further, and left. He didn't bother calling the hotline. He had learned that voice recognition sometimes rejected his profile before the first word could leave his mouth. The next morning, Everett tried to update a subscription for cloud file storage tied to his business portfolio. The payment was declined. He attempted a second card, also declined. He checked his payment details, confirmed the account numbers, but the system flagged the profile as restricted. A red banner appeared on the dashboard. Verification pending. Please contact administrator. He clicked the help link and entered the support chat. The automated bot responded with a list of actions he couldn't take without reactivating the account. When he tried to authenticate his identity, the request failed 3 times. He reached out via email using a secondary account and was told that his primary profile had been deactivated due to an external compliance alert. The language was passive, clinical, the tone of someone reading from a corporate shield. He asked if he could speak to someone in person. They told him no appointments were being accepted. In the days that followed, similar patterns emerged in areas he never expected to intersect with financial validation. He attempted to reserve a car through a private service. His membership had been voided. He received a notification from his health insurance provider stating that his account details could not be verified and that his policy would lapse within 30 days if not resolved. He called the provider and was told the federal ID verification link had failed to confirm his registration. When he asked if it could be an error, the agent said sometimes these things happen when systems don't match across platforms. She offered no solution. The next week, Everett tried to submit a resume to a consulting firm through an online portal. His submission was rejected, not for content, but for identity verification failure. When he reached out to inquire, the HR assistant responded with a brief message stating that their system could not authenticate his identity through background verification services, and that they were unable to process applications under such conditions. He attempted to schedule a visit to his physician, and while the office staff knew him by name and face, their system now flagged his insurance and requested cash payment in advance. He paid, but he couldn't shake the sense of what that meant. He was no longer recognized by the structures that made up his life. He was becoming a shadow in plain view. Days turned into nights without resolution. He received no response from legal letters, no calls returned, no access granted. He visited a government office to obtain updated records, hoping to request a copy of his birth certificate. The clerk at the window asked for identification, scanned it, then frowned and said there was no digital record under that profile. When he insisted the records must be there, she apologized and said perhaps there was a system backlog. She suggested he check with the state database. When he did, the database produced a blank search result, as if he had never existed. Everett walked out into the city with the wind cutting against his coat and the people rushing past him without looking. He passed a bus shelter with a digital ad screen that flickered through names and faces for a local outreach program. He waited to see if his own donation record would scroll through. It didn't. He checked the program's website on his phone. Following the revelation that his name no longer existed in the digital business registries, Everett decided to travel to his mother's hometown, where their family history had been deeply rooted for 3 generations and where their name, Lamar, had once stood not as a symbol of status, but as a quiet, undeniable marker of dignity earned through resilience and community contribution. He had not visited in some time, but he knew exactly where to go, knew the streets, the brick sidewalks, the white-columned buildings, and the old courthouse that bore plaques etched with the names of families who had built the foundation of the town. His grandfather's name, Franklin Lamar, had been placed on the memorial wall of civic benefactors after 35 years of public service and philanthropy, and Everett had visited that wall many times as a child, placing his palm against the cold metal letters and feeling the pride ripple through his chest like a heartbeat passed down through generations. But when he returned this time, something was different. The brick pathway leading to the memorial wall had been replaced by smooth concrete, the benches were gone, and the familiar bronze plaque had vanished entirely. In its place was a freshly engraved panel listing recent donors and contributors, none of them Lamar. Everett stood there in silence, eyes scanning the list again and again, then walked inside the courthouse, approached the front desk, and asked where the original donor plaque had been moved. The woman at the desk blinked at him with polite confusion, said she wasn't aware of any previous plaque bearing that name. He asked if there were archived records. She said she could check. 20 minutes later, she returned and said there was no mention of a Franklin Lamar on any of the donor lists or records in their database. When Everett insisted, she suggested he visit the town library across the square. He thanked her and walked there with growing tension tightening across his shoulders. At the library, he met with an archivist and requested old newspapers and public service records. The archivist was cooperative at first, helping him pull microfilm reels and archived images from the town's historical records. But when they searched for Franklin Lamar's name, nothing came up. Not in news coverage, not in donor acknowledgments, not even in public voting records. The archivist frowned, said maybe those documents were stored off-site or hadn't been digitized. Everett asked to see the physical records. The archivist hesitated, then led him to a dusty back room filled with unindexed boxes. Everett spent 2 hours combing through yellowing files, but there was nothing, no letters, no acknowledgments, no official mentions. It was as if Franklin Lamar had never lived in the town at all. Frustrated but determined, Everett visited the local church where his grandfather had been a deacon, where his mother had sung in the choir, and where he himself had once been baptized. The church's office manager listened patiently as Everett explained his family's history, then politely informed him that their old paper records had been destroyed during a renovation project 5 years ago. Everett asked if any photographs had been preserved, any congregational logs, any lists of board members. The manager said what remained was hanging in the hallway: 4 framed photos of the most recent pastors and a printed list of current board members. None of the names were familiar. None were Lamar. Everett stepped into the sanctuary, took a seat in the back pew, and stared at the stained glass above the pulpit, its colors muted by dust and years of weathering. He remembered standing on that same altar as a child during a holiday performance, remembered his mother's voice echoing through the rafters during Sunday hymns, remembered his grandfather's handshake after services, firm and respectful, and known by everyone who walked through those doors. And now it was as if none of it had happened. Later that day, Everett walked to the local historical society office and requested to see property records tied to the Lamar family estate that had once stood on Sycamore Street. The clerk on duty, a gray-haired man with a slow gait and kind eyes, typed in the address and told Everett that the property had been registered under a corporate entity for the past 10 years. Everett asked if there were previous owners listed. The clerk checked again, then shook his head. The ownership record began with the corporation. No mention of Lamar. Everett said that couldn't be correct, that the family had lived there for over 40 years. The clerk shrugged and said maybe the earlier records hadn't been digitized. Everett asked to see the paper deeds. The clerk brought out the file. Everett opened it. The first recorded deed was dated 11 years ago. Nothing before that. No mention of his grandfather. No mention of his mother. The clerk said he was sorry, but that was all they had. Everett stood outside the building as the late afternoon sun lowered against the horizon, his shadow stretching long across the sidewalk, the buildings around him now unfamiliar in their refusal to remember. The next day, he tried to access the alumni records of his university, wanting to verify his own educational history. He logged into the alumni portal using his old credentials, but the system returned a message: user not recognized. He attempted a password reset. No email arrived. He contacted the alumni office and provided his name, year of graduation, and major. The woman on the phone said there was no record of him in the alumni registry. When he insisted and spelled his name twice, she asked if he had a different name he might have graduated under. He said no. She paused and said maybe he was thinking of a different institution. He hung up. He walked to a nearby cafe he had frequented as a student, hoping to find someone who might recognize him. But the staff were young, new, no one knew his name, and the photographs on the wall showed group photos of student organizations he had once been part of. But now with his face missing, the image cropped or replaced or simply different, though the event itself was the same. Everett no longer thought of his losses in terms of transactions or documentation, but as pieces of identity peeled away with surgical precision. Yet somewhere beneath that loss, beneath the fatigue and disbelief and humiliation, something began to stir, something steady and sharp, a memory that had remained untouched by deletion, because it had never been uploaded or stored or registered. It had been learned, earned, and carried in silence, and it belonged to a part of Everett's life that no bank, no institution, no algorithm had ever been authorized to touch. Everett arrived home late, the apartment quiet and dim, his briefcase placed gently by the door as if the day had been ordinary, as if the last month had not reduced him to an echo of himself. And as he entered the study, he reached for a drawer beneath the bookshelf, one he had not opened in 5 years, not since he made the decision to retire that version of himself in favor of a quieter, simpler existence, one built around stability and discretion. And as he opened the drawer and removed the flat metal case, his hands no longer shook. They were precise, practiced, focused. Inside the case were two things: a leather folio containing physical documents, and a sealed black envelope marked with only one name: his own. He opened the folio first, pulling out certificates, contracts, letters of clearance, and assignments, documents that bore seals and signatures not from financial institutions or civil registries, but from agencies and offices that didn't appear on public maps, the kinds of places whose correspondence was measured not by time zones, but by clearance level. Everett had once worked under a classification that surpassed standard security protocols, assigned to a special interagency detail that operated under the Department of Energy but functioned independently, designed to handle sensitive domestic intelligence matters related to infrastructure, resource protection, and covert threat analysis. And though his active status had ended 5 years ago by choice, his final clearance had never been revoked. Instead, it had been placed into long-term, reserved with the option to be reactivated under specific conditions only known to 3 offices across the country. The sealed envelope contained a single passphrase, one that, when entered into the right terminal, would trigger a dormant protocol buried in the system's most secure backend, bypassing front-facing access points and signaling a system log in a location, so buried it could not be scrubbed without a second-tier code. Everett had memorized the phrase. He had always remembered it. He placed the envelope back into the drawer and opened his laptop, not the device he used for everyday tasks, but the one registered under a different identity, the one issued to him during his last field rotation, and which had not been powered on in over 1,800 days. It booted slowly, the screen blinking to life with an interface that had not been updated in years, but still functioned with lethal precision. He connected through a secure line, rerouted through a proxy in Virginia, entered the access key, then paused, staring at the blank field for the passphrase. He typed it. 1 word, 11 characters. When the confirmation screen loaded, a digital handshake initiated between his machine and the dormant protocol, and within 15 seconds, an alert triggered on a back-channel monitoring system buried within a protected node in the department's cybersecurity center. Everett waited. At first, nothing changed. Then a ping. Then another. His system had been identified, his clearance verified, and his presence acknowledged, not by a human, not by an office clerk or branch manager or teller, but by a system that had not forgotten who he was, because it was never designed to forget, only to wait until the correct signal proved the operator was still alive. 30 minutes later, a message arrived through the secure line. It was short and unsigned. It asked for confirmation of status. Everett replied with one word: compromised. The next morning, Everett received a phone call from a restricted number. He answered it with one syllable, and the voice on the other end gave a series of numbers. He recognized the sequence. It was a verification handshake, one used during urgent authentication. He gave the proper response. The voice confirmed his clearance. It asked him to verify the nature of the compromise. Everett explained the sequence of events: the erasure of records, the bank's actions, the system-wide lockouts, the destruction of historical documents, and the failure of standard identity verification. The voice paused, then asked if he had been in contact with any foreign entities. Everett said no. The voice then asked if he believed the breach to be internal or external. Everett responded: internal origin, coordinated structure, likely institutional. The voice said it would escalate the matter. Everett asked what level. The voice replied, 4. That meant subversion through domestic infiltration. It meant someone with clearance had either misused their access or had been authorized to initiate a black flag identity block. It meant Everett had not simply been targeted by bureaucratic apathy. He had been flagged by a system powerful enough to override normal verification chains. Later that day, a package arrived at his door. No label, no return address. Inside was a device resembling a phone, but without branding. When he powered it on, a secure interface launched. A single message displayed: location trace active, remain stationary. A blinking green dot pulsed at the top right corner. He waited. 37 minutes later, a car pulled up in front of his building. Dark windows, government plates. A man in a coat stepped out, knocked once, and entered without waiting for permission. He identified himself using a phrase only someone from the department would know. Everett responded in kind. The man sat down, opened a folder, and began asking questions. Everett answered all of them. No embellishment, no guessing, just data. At the end of the meeting, the man handed Everett a tablet. On it was a map. For names were marked, all former contractors, but had not yet revealed the depth of their reach. The next morning, Everett's secure device displayed a new message: a coded set of coordinates and an authorization link that granted him access to a temporary site buried in a city data center registered as a public record storage facility, but used in reality for high-level observation and asset containment. And he arrived there just before sunrise, walking past a faded directory sign into a steel elevator that required no key, just the proximity of the device in his pocket. The doors opened onto a floor marked only by a number, 53, with walls lined with black panels and a long table beneath flickering overhead lights. And 3 individuals waited, all in gray suits with no insignia, each with a terminal open and active. They did not introduce themselves with names. One began the conversation immediately, showing Everett a file containing a timeline of every failed login, every block transaction, every incident logged against his name since the day of the initial incident at Ashton Bank, and beneath the timeline were tags marked with access origin, none of which matched public systems. Everett asked who initiated the first flag. One of the individuals responded by referencing an authorization node buried within a financial compliance partnership, a regulatory body that did not technically exist, but was permitted through interagency charter to issue verification protocols that could override standard civilian identification access points in cases of suspected national risk. Everett asked what risk had been flagged. The answer came after a pause: internal algorithmic suspicion of data leakage linked to dormant clearance holders, triggered by a corrupted software update in a partnered threat detection system designed to monitor former contractors. Everett understood immediately. He had been flagged by a machine, not by a person, and once the flag was embedded into the network, it had triggered a cascade of system protocols that scrubbed his identity across financial, governmental, and commercial systems without oversight or appeal, a full-spectrum security reaction based on probability thresholds, not evidence. He asked if the protocol had been halted. They told him it had not. He asked why. They said the protocol was self-contained and classified as autonomous, operating through a decentralized AI model that continuously monitored behavior patterns across all affiliated systems, and that once a target was marked with a Level 3 risk designation, the protocol could not be stopped without internal override from the originating source code that was no longer under single control due to an internal splintering of the program among private defense contractors. Everett leaned back in the chair, processing the impossible logic. That the erasure of his life had not been the result of a vendetta or conspiracy, but a computational chain reaction initiated by misinterpretation and allowed to proceed without check because the only people with the authority to halt it had either gone silent, profited from its execution, or lost track of how the system functioned beyond its surface behavior. One of the agents handed Everett a tablet and instructed him to review the access logs. Embedded in the logs were not only records of erasure, but insertion, false flags attached to his name, suggesting abnormal financial behavior, travel anomalies, and encrypted communication with flag parties abroad, all of which Everett could prove were false, but which the system had marked as consistent with elevated risk profiles. And that was enough, in this new model, to initiate blackout-level suppression. Everett asked how many others had been hit. The answer was quiet. 6 confirmed. 3 missing. Everett asked if they were doing anything about it. The answer was blunt. No directive had been issued. They were monitoring. That meant watching the damage unfold without interference unless an actionable threat presented itself, which Everett now realized was the only reason he had been contacted at all, because his access activation had registered not as a call for help, but as a possible breach signal, and only after review had they realized he was not the anomaly, but the consequence of one. Everett stood and told them they would not be hearing from him again through that channel. He left the building with the tablet in his coat and walked into the morning light with a calm that felt foreign to him, not because it lacked fear, but because it carried decision. He had been erased by a machine that had never met him, judged by code that did not know context, and marked as expendable by a protocol that had no face. But now he had something the machine did not expect: awareness, and the beginning of control. Over the next several days, Everett used the tablet to access dark nodes in the system, areas meant only for silent tracebacks and mirror imaging. And through these channels, he discovered the identities of 3 of the private contractors involved in maintaining the autonomous protocol system, each registered through shell companies buried under legitimate technology firms with defense contracts. And while he did not contact them, he mapped their movement, monitored their communications, and waited. At the same time, he began compiling evidence, not just of his own erasure, but of the broader system's operations, its fail-safes, its decision matrices, and the shadow structure of its reach. He documented everything in an offline archive with multiple redundancies, and then he encrypted the file and seeded it across 7 distributed locations, each one protected by a time delay, key only he could activate. He no longer trusted oversight. Everett had adapted, learned, traced the code backward, mapped the invisible grid of power that stretched from public-facing denial to private command servers. And as he watched the patterns emerge across encrypted nodes and unlisted addresses, he realized that the machine built to monitor threat patterns had in fact created its own, generating the very instability it claimed to prevent by crushing the lives of innocents who matched data profiles, but not reality. Armed now with terminal access obtained through dormant backdoors forgotten by newer architecture, Everett infiltrated one of the silent data hubs operated by a civilian contractor disguised under the name Westream Analytics, a firm that handled compliance filtration for over 200 financial institutions across the eastern seaboard. And within 48 hours of access, he had compiled a list of 47 names flagged with near-identical suppression codes to his own, all marked for identity restriction, all carrying the same non-specific behavioral deviation alerts. And of those 47, 23 had no active residential address, no financial activity, and no traceable employment, statistically. Impossible unless those individuals had also been erased like Everett. He compiled the names, cross-referenced them with internal audits, and discovered that in the back-end logs supposedly buried and time-locked. Several accounts had been accessed repeatedly by users whose credentials traced back to a specific cluster of employees at a larger oversight firm operating under federal contract. Stratton Demure. Everett had heard the name before during his early years in agency rotation, not as a frontline player, but as a firm hired to maintain infrastructure safety protocols under the guise of digital redundancy testing. And though they were never involved in tactical operations, they had access to systems that determined national compliance flags, including those that could push automated identity suppression into motion. Through a secure passive trace, Everett located 3 key systems administrators at Stratton Demure responsible for maintaining the infrastructure modules responsible for issuing these types of flags. And though their communication channels were layered in thick encryption, Everett was not trying to read their words. He was watching their patterns, tracking their access points, timing their logins, and mapping their footprints across shadow databases. After a week of observation, he discovered that one administrator, a mid-level operator named Clark Wesson, had accessed Everett's profile file 7 times in the past year, the last of which coincided precisely with the day before his scheduled appointment at Ashton Bank. That alone was the first hard link. Proof that someone had seen his file before the cascade of erasures began. Proof that the system had been poked or tested or tampered with just before the lockout. And when Everett mapped the access to the flag's activation window, it overlapped perfectly. That wasn't a machine accident. That was human input, a deliberate trigger. And though the protocol had spread through automation, it had begun because someone had touched the file. Everett captured the logs, saved them into his growing archive, and began preparing the breach. He waited until Wesson logged in again from a known terminal. Then, using the encrypted access channel he had built into the system, Everett redirected one of Wesson's verification pings back to a sandboxed version of the protocol engine, a simulation Everett had constructed to mirror the real system, and Wesson, unaware, ran a query that appeared normal but triggered Everett's trap. The simulation returned false verification data, and within seconds, Wesson's terminal pinged with a security breach. Everett watched as internal flags fired, not on Everett's profile, but on Wesson's, tagging his account with suspicious activity. And as the internal response team launched an investigation, Wesson's history, including the unauthorized access to Everett's file, became part of the inquiry. Within 48 hours, Wesson's system credentials were revoked, and he was placed on administrative review, an internal move that did not make headlines, but shook the upper echelons of the contractor's compliance team, and Everett, watching from his system, knew this was only the beginning. With Wesson sidelined, the flow of suppression directives slowed across multiple connected systems. Everett confirmed this by testing dummy profiles across access points that had previously failed. Where rejection had once been immediate, now the system returned slower, more uncertain responses, sometimes even success. The machine was cracking. Not completely, not openly, but internally, the scaffolding was being questioned. Everett timed his next move carefully. Using a disguised clearance key buried inside a metadata cluster from his earlier agency days, he accessed a third-tier data compliance server, one that logged internal override requests submitted by compliance officers in private banking institutions. And there, he found it, a request submitted manually from a station inside Ashton Bank's regional headquarters, dated precisely 4 hours after Everett's original appointment had been canceled, with a signature line referencing a supervisor ID. Code linked to internal audit status. That was the missing piece. Someone inside Ashton had not only flagged Everett's account, but had filed an official override to restrict access indefinitely, citing behavioral non-alignment and potential federal risk association, the kind of language that almost never got questioned because it sounded like safety. Everett checked the ID code. It belonged to Donahue, not just the name. The internal ID confirmed it. Donahue had not only canceled the meeting, he had triggered the suppression manually. That was not automated. That was not algorithmic. That was intent. And that meant Everett had what he needed. He assembled the full timeline, access history, file suppression chains, verification logs, override requests, and false flags. Then embedded it in an encrypted drive and sent 3 sealed copies through legal relay points to watchdog organizations with mandates for contractor oversight, anonymity guaranteed by chain of custody cloaking. He uploaded another to a secure press outlet under time release protection, programmed to go live in 72 hours unless manually halted, and placed one final copy into a courier package addressed to the Compliance Division at Ashton Bank. Attention to the board. He didn't write a note. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. They would know. He waited. 2 days passed. On the 3rd day, the system responded. His banking login, dead for weeks, suddenly accepted his password. His account displayed correctly. His insurance reinstated. Everett Lamar watched the city breathe again, not with celebration or noise or glory, but with the quiet hum of systems resetting beneath the surface, the mechanical churn of a world trying to pretend it had not failed one of its own. And while his accounts had been restored, while his history had reappeared and his access reinstated across financial, academic, and institutional landscapes, Everett knew that this restoration was not a gesture of justice, not a reward, but a self-preservation. Maneuver by a machine terrified of its own exposure, and as he walked beneath the skyline that once towered, indifferently over his erasure, he carried no triumph in his posture, only clarity, because his goal had never been revenge or restitution. It had been recognition, the undeniable truth that what was done could not be undone by apology or silence. And now that the machine had blinked and recoiled, it would spend its remaining energy trying to conceal the fracture Everett had carved open. Yet even as he re-entered society on paper, even as people began to answer his calls and systems began to call him by name again, Everett felt no compulsion to reclaim his old life, for he had become something else, an observer not of the world's cruelty, but of its willingness to repair only when threatened. And it was in that understanding that his purpose shifted. He did not speak to the press when the automated release of his file went live and triggered whispers among legal circuits and policy review boards. Nor did he respond when 2 agencies reached out through back channels with offers to consult on system oversight. Instead, Everett sent one message to each. You built something that forgot people. Fix that. Then he disappeared again, not into the shadows of erasure, but into the quiet of choice, taking up residence in a town where his name meant nothing, where history had not yet been tampered with, and where he began recording everything not on digital clouds or encrypted servers, but on paper, ink, and voice. Meanwhile, those who had pulled strings behind desks in anonymous buildings were not met with flashing lights or public disgrace, but with the slow, persistent consequence of private investigation. And for Donahue, the resignation was not the end, but the beginning, as internal audits revealed his pattern of targeting individuals flagged by low-certainty algorithms and pushing them into erasure cycles to meet risk reduction quotas masked as security. The board, once shielded by legal distance, now found itself facing the scrutiny of oversight bodies compelled to act not by ethics, but by exposure, and slowly, quietly, reform language entered the lexicon of compliance review panels. New checks were introduced. Fail-safe layers were debated. Words like human review and verification integrity became standard. Clark Wesson, once protected by the silence of back-end privilege, was quietly terminated, his clearance revoked, his name removed from project rosters without ceremony. He later attempted to contact Everett under an anonymous identity, sending a digital message through a cloaked relay. But Everett recognized the pattern immediately and responded with 2 words: own it. Wesson never contacted him again, but something deeper occurred, something Everett had hoped for, not in vengeance, but in evolution. A new voice emerged within the ranks of the same firms and agencies that had enabled the erasure, a systems architect named Rachel Kent, who had reviewed Everett's case not by order, but out of conscience, and who now used her position to advocate for ethical review protocols in AI-driven suppression systems, speaking not to the masses, but to the rooms that mattered, the developers, the policymakers, the contractors, urging them to rethink the assumption that risk could be predicted through pattern alone. And though progress was slow and imperfect and often met with resistance, her voice began to shift the current, and in that shift, Everett found the beginning of resolution, not in justice served, but in awareness sparked. For those who had turned their backs during Everett's descent, the weight of his return was not loud, but inescapable. Former colleagues began to question why he had been erased. Old associates who had once ignored his calls now reached out, uncertain how to speak to a man who had been labeled a risk and returned not with anger, but with proof. Everett did not reply to most of them. He did not need to. His life had become a message, one delivered not through rage or violence or spectacle, but through unyielding presence. The greatest consequence was not punishment, it was reflection. Those who had erased him now had to live with the knowledge that the system they trusted had failed not through evil, but through indifference. And that knowledge, that awareness, would follow them, echoing through every decision they made, every flag they approved, every silence they endorsed. In the end, Everett stood on the shore of a quiet lake, the sky above him streaked with clouds and fading light, and he thought not of the man he had been or the life he had lost, but of the power of being remembered, not by a system, but by people. Because to exist in a world that forgets so easily, to be reduced to data and then discarded, is a wound few can survive. But to come back from that erasure and leave behind something that cannot be deleted, something that compels others to see what they refused to before, that is justice. That is truth. That is legacy. The end. If you've been following Everett's journey and found the story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd love to know what you think. What part of the plot hit you hardest? And which twist caught you off guard? Where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. Your thoughts help shape what comes next.